Imagine a world where innovation wasn't born in a gleaming lab or a quiet workshop, but on the battlefield itself, forged in the brutal crucible of war. This wasn't just about crafting better swords or stronger armor. This was a relentless, high-stakes game of survival, where the penalty for falling behind was not a loss of profit, but the very annihilation of your civilization. For ancient Rome, every battle was a lesson, every enemy a teacher, and every new piece of technology a desperate move in a global game of chess. But what was the true secret to their dominance? It wasn't genius invention. It was something far more cunning, far more adaptive, and ultimately far more terrifying. This isn't the history you read in textbooks, it's the story of an empire. Built one borrowed idea, one clever adaptation, and one brilliant, brutal innovation at a time. It's the story of a civilization that didn't just win its wars, it learned its way to victory. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you're as fascinated by the hidden gears of history as we are, hit that like button to let us know. Subscribing is the best way to make sure you don't miss our next deep dive, and sharing this video with a friend helps us bring these forgotten stories to light. Your support really does make a difference. In the beginning, Rome wasn't an empire. It was a scrappy little city-state, perched precariously on 7 hills, surrounded by enemies on all sides. The year is roughly 400 BC, and to the north lie the powerful Etruscans, to the south and east, the fierce Samnites, and a little later, the terrifying Gauls would come sweeping down from the north. This wasn't a time for grand strategy or abstract theories of war. This was a time for survival, and the Romans quickly realized one brutal truth: adapt or be annihilated. Their first army, if you could even call it that, was basically a copy of their neighbors. They adopted the Greek phalanx, a rigid, tightly packed formation of spearmen, because it was the most effective military technology of the day. Every man, typically a citizen with enough property to afford his own gear, was a hoplite, wearing a bronze helmet and breastplate, and carrying a long spear. It worked, to a point. For small, pitched battles on flat ground, the phalanx was a terrifying, almost unstoppable force. It was a solid wall of iron and muscle, a blunt instrument designed to smash its way through an opponent. But the Roman heartland wasn't the flat plains of Greece. It was a rugged, mountainous, and densely forested peninsula, and their enemies, particularly the Samnites, didn't fight in neat, predictable lines. They were mobile. They used ambushes, and they were masters of their treacherous terrain. This rigid, unyielding Roman phalanx, so effective on a flat field, was a disaster in the hills and valleys of central Italy. A single broken line, a sudden gap, and the entire formation would unravel, a domino effect of chaos and defeat. The Romans were losing badly, and they knew their very existence hung in the balance. So they did what they did best. They learned. They watched their enemies, particularly the agile Samnites, and began to rethink their entire military philosophy. It wasn't about being the biggest, most impenetrable bloc anymore. It was about being the most flexible. It was a subtle but revolutionary shift in thinking. And it gave birth to one of the most brilliant military inventions of the ancient world, the manipular legion. Imagine a phalanx with joints, as the Romans themselves described it. They broke their massive formations down into smaller, more manageable units called maniples, each roughly 120 men. These maniples were arranged in 3 distinct lines. The first line was the hastati, young, eager soldiers. Behind them were the principes, the veterans and more experienced fighters. And finally, in the rear, were the triarii, the hardened old-timers, the final reserve. The entire formation looked like a chessboard, with gaps between each maniple. It was a radical idea. Why would you leave gaps in your lines? Because those gaps were the key to everything. This new system allowed for incredible tactical flexibility. A maniple could advance, hold a position, or fall back to be replaced by the unit behind it. The hastati could push the enemy, and if they faltered, they could retreat through the gaps to the second line, the principes, who would then take up the fight. It was a system of fluid motion and coordinated support. No longer was a single broken line a death sentence. It was just a temporary setback, a chance to reform and unleash fresh troops. This wasn't about brute force. It was about resilience and adaptation. Over the next 2 centuries, the Roman army continued to refine this design. By the late Republic, a new problem had emerged. The citizen soldiers who had traditionally filled the ranks were a dwindling resource. Land was being consolidated into large estates, and the poorest citizens couldn't afford the equipment needed to serve. A brilliant and politically explosive solution was proposed by the general Gaius Marius. He removed the property qualification for soldiers, opening the ranks to the landless poor. This single act transformed the Roman military from a part-time citizen militia into a professional standing army. These professional soldiers were trained year-round and received standardized equipment from the state. The manipular system, while effective, was a little clunky for managing vast armies on long campaigns. So, the maniples were grouped together into even larger units called cohorts. A cohort was about 480 men, a much more uniform and easily commanded unit than the old system. Now a general could maneuver entire cohorts rather than just small maniples, making grand-scale battles more manageable and organized. This professionalized army was a force unlike any the world had ever seen. They didn't just fight. They marched for days with an unheard-of discipline, building a fortified camp, a castrum, every single night. These camps were so standardized that legionaries could build them in the dark, a perfect grid of streets and tents protected by a wall and a ditch. This was military technology that wasn't a weapon at all. It was an organization, a system, an unstoppable machine built on discipline, logistics, and unwavering resolve. Rome's early arms race wasn't about who had the sharpest sword or the fastest horse. It was about who could learn the fastest. It was a relentless process of trial and error, a brutal feedback loop of defeat and adaptation. The rigid Greek phalanx gave way to the flexible Roman legion, which was then refined into the professional army of the Republic. Each change wasn't the result of some brilliant singular mind, but a collective pragmatic response to a very real and very terrifying threat. Rome was being shaped by its enemies, forged by the very forces that sought to destroy it. And this wasn't just a military shift, it was a societal one. The rise of the professional army fundamentally changed the relationship between the Roman state and its citizens, creating a new class of soldiers whose loyalty was earned through pay, land, and the promise of a future. It laid the foundation for the political power of ambitious generals, a dynamic that would eventually tear the Republic apart. But that's a story for another time. The most important takeaway from this early period isn't the names of the legions or the dates of the battles. It's the core philosophy that would define Rome's military success for the next 5 centuries. They didn't have to be the first to invent something. They just had to be the best at copying, adapting, and perfecting it. And their next great test would come not on the land, but on the open sea, against a rival they had no earthly business defeating. How did a city of landlubbers with no navy, to speak of, conquer the most dominant maritime power in the Mediterranean? Stay with us. Imagine you're a Roman senator in the year 264 BC. You've just finished consolidating control over the Italian peninsula, a monumental task. You have the most disciplined and effective land army in the world. You're at the top of your game. But now you look across the narrow strait to the island of Sicily, and you see something that fills you with dread. The ships of Carthage. Carthage, the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. Carthage, whose trade empire stretches from Africa to Spain. Carthage, a naval superpower with a fleet of hundreds of powerful, swift warships and a centuries-long legacy of seafaring. Rome, on the other hand, has, well, they have some fishing boats. This wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't even a fight. It was a joke. For centuries, naval power had been the domain of the Phoenicians, the Greeks, and now the Carthaginians. It was a specialized, highly technical art form built on speed, maneuverability, and the deadly force of a ramming attack. Roman soldiers were trained to fight on solid ground, in formation, with swords and shields. You can't do that on a rocking ship. The Romans had no shipyards, no experienced sailors, and no tactical knowledge of naval warfare. The First Punic War, the great conflict with Carthage, was about to begin, and Rome was starting from a position of profound, almost comical, weakness. Part 2. But here's where that famous Roman pragmatism comes into play. They didn't see a problem, they saw an opportunity. The story, possibly a legend but a powerful one nonetheless, says that a Carthaginian quinquereme, a massive warship with 5 banks of oars, wrecked on the coast of Italy. The Romans didn't see a disaster. They saw a blueprint. They took the wrecked ship apart, piece by piece, and built a full-scale replica. But they didn't just copy it. They improved it, or at least they adapted it to their unique style of warfare. This wasn't about building a better ship. It was about building a better battlefield. And that's where the most brilliant and audacious invention of the war comes in, the Corvus. The word means crow or raven in Latin, and it was a hinged, heavy plank with a massive spiked hook on the end. It was like a medieval drawbridge meets a grappling hook. The Romans installed one on the bow of each of their newly built ships. When they closed in on an enemy vessel, they would swing the Corvus into position and drop it with a sickening thud. The spike would impale the deck of the enemy ship, locking the 2 vessels together. What happened next was a game changer. Naval combat was no longer about ramming and sinking. It was about boarding. Once the ships were locked, Roman legionaries, the best land soldiers in the world, poured across the Corvus and onto the enemy deck. What was a naval engagement a moment ago became a land battle on a floating piece of wood. The Carthaginian sailors, skilled as they were no match for the brutal, disciplined Roman fighting style. The Romans had effectively taken their greatest strength, their infantry, and used a clever piece of technology to neutralize their enemy's greatest strength, their naval expertise. Part 3. With the Corvus, Rome began to win. But a single clever invention wasn't enough to conquer the Mediterranean. The Romans also showed their incredible logistical capacity. Remember, they were able to build a fleet of hundreds of ships in a matter of months, an astonishing feat of engineering and resource management. They mobilized their vast population and centralized their planning. Timber, tools, and labor were all efficiently gathered, proving that Rome's genius wasn't just on the battlefield but in the supply chain. Over the course of the long, grueling war, Roman naval tactics also evolved. The Carthaginians, learning from their early defeats, began to maneuver faster and more unpredictably to avoid the Corvus. In response, the Romans gradually phased out the cumbersome device in favor of more flexible tactics. They began to rely on faster, lighter ships, like the Liburnian, adapted from the Illyrian pirates they had encountered. This new, versatile fleet could fight in different ways, not just through boarding, but through skilled ramming and blockades. This process of adaptation, this willingness to learn and change, was the real secret to their victory at sea. They started with nothing, borrowed from their enemy, created an ingenious counter-technology, and then, as their skills improved, they abandoned that very technology when it was no longer needed. The Punic Wars were a lesson in military transformation. By the end of the conflict, Rome wasn't just a land power with a makeshift navy. It was a combined land and sea force, capable of projecting its power and securing its interests across the entire Western Mediterranean. Part 4. The long-term impact of this naval arms race was immeasurable. Rome now had the strategic ability to move troops and supplies anywhere in the Mediterranean. They could blockade coasts, control trade routes, and quickly deploy legions to distant shores. The logistical foundation they built for their navy became a blueprint for their future. Infrastructure projects, from roads to aqueducts. The experience gained in the Punic Wars set the stage for Rome's global ambitions. And so, the Roman military machine, once a land-based juggernaut, was now a multifaceted weapon of war, equally comfortable on land and sea. They had taken on the most skilled sailors in the world, and through a mix of ruthless pragmatism and clever innovation, had come out on top. But their next challenge wouldn't be just about tactical supremacy. It would be about facing the most sophisticated, technologically advanced armies in the ancient world. The Hellenistic kingdoms of the East were waiting, with their massive siege engines and disciplined, highly trained infantry. Rome had copied a wrecked ship, But how would they copy a world of advanced engineering? With Carthage defeated, Rome's gaze turned eastward. They had mastered the art of land warfare and, against all odds, had become a naval power. Now, they were about to collide with a new and more sophisticated world, the Hellenistic kingdoms. These weren't tribal enemies or scrappy city-states. These were the heirs of Alexander the Great's empire, rich, technologically advanced, and masters of a military science far more intricate than anything Rome had encountered. Their armies were a marvel of discipline and engineering, a far cry from the enemies of the Samnite Wars. The Romans' challenge wasn't just to win, it was to prove their legions could face the world's most elite armies and win. The motivation was simple: prestige, wealth, and the chance to cement their status as a true superpower. When the Romans met these new enemies, they faced a familiar foe in a different form, the phalanx. But this wasn't the simple phalanx of the Greeks they had faced before. The Macedonian phalanx was an evolved, deadly machine, an impenetrable wall of interlocking shields and 18-foot pikes called sarissas. In open battle, it was a terrifying sight. How could a Roman legionary, with his short gladius sword and throwing spear, possibly get close enough to fight? Once again, Rome's answer wasn't about matching force with force. It was about leveraging their own core strength. At the Battle of Cynocephaly in 197 BC, the Roman legion proved that flexibility could overcome sheer mass. The Macedonian phalanx, so dominant on flat ground, struggled to maintain its formation on the uneven terrain of the Greek hills. Roman maniples, the phalanx with joints, used the broken ground to their advantage, slipping into gaps in the Macedonian lines and attacking the exposed flanks and rears. The result was a stunning Roman victory that proved the superiority of their adaptable formations. Part 2. But the Hellenistic world offered more than just a military puzzle to solve. It presented an arsenal of advanced military technology, particularly in the art of siege warfare. The Romans were good at building things, but the Greeks were on another level. For centuries, Greek engineers had perfected complex siege engines like the ballista and the onager. The ballista was a giant crossbow, a torsion-powered weapon that could launch massive bolts or stones with incredible force over long distances, capable of tearing through walls and enemy formations. The onager, or wild ass, was a catapult that used a single twisted rope to hurl heavy rocks, smashing fortifications and gates with a thunderous impact. The Romans didn't just copy these. They adopted them, standardized them, and integrated them into their armies as a regular professional component. They brought in Greek engineers and their expertise, adding these powerful tools to the legion's arsenal. They even encountered mechanical marvels like the polybolos, a repeating bolt thrower, which was essentially an ancient machine gun. By the time of the late Republic, no Roman army was complete without its corps of engineers and its array of these sophisticated siege machines. This fusion of Roman organization and Greek engineering reached its peak under generals like Julius Caesar. At the siege of Alesia in 52 BC, Caesar's army didn't just attack the Gallic stronghold. They completely enveloped it with an unprecedented network of fortifications. They built a massive double wall, one facing the city and one facing out to protect against a relieving Gallic army, complete with watchtowers, trenches, and hidden traps. It was a masterpiece of military engineering, and it demonstrated that the Roman army was not just a fighting force, but a construction company on a grand scale. Part 3. But for the Romans, siegecraft was just one part of a larger logistical machine. Every legionary, from the lowest recruit to the most decorated veteran, was a part-time engineer. They carried the tools of their trade, shovels, pickaxes, and saws, and they used them constantly. The Roman military machine was a testament to the idea that an army travels on its stomach and that it's only as good as its infrastructure. Roman roads and bridges weren't just for travel. They were military arteries, allowing supplies, reinforcements, and messages to move at lightning speed. They built huge permanent supply depots called horaea and established a system of supply lines that could sustain an army far from home. A testament to this is the massive military-built watermill complex at Barbagal, which provided a steady supply of flour for troops in the region. Rome's genius was in its ability to take a technology, whether a weapon or a system, and make it scalable, reliable, and uniform. It's the difference between a prototype and a mass-produced industrial-grade product. The Romans weren't just stealing ideas. They were building an ecosystem of war. Their soldiers were not just fighters, but builders. Their armies were not just a collection of men, but a complete system of logistics, engineering, and combat. They had learned to take the strengths of their enemies, the tactical flexibility of the Samnites, the naval expertise of the Carthaginians, and now the engineering prowess of the Hellenistic kingdoms, and combine them into a whole that was far greater than the sum of its parts. They had solidified their reputation as a military superpower, and in doing so, they had set a new standard for warfare in the ancient world. But their journey of adaptation was far from over. Their empire was about to expand to its far-flung, hostile edges, where they would encounter new enemies and new military challenges that would force them to change all over again. By the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire was at its peak, but with that sprawling power came new problems, particularly along its vast and hostile borders. To the east lay the mighty Parthian and later Sassanid empires, powers that didn't fight, with the massed infantry of the Greeks but with heavily armored cavalry and deadly mounted archers. To the north, the Germanic tribes and Dacians posed a different kind of threat. Fast-moving, unpredictable warriors who used ambushes and guerrilla-style attacks to hit and run. Rome's military machine, so perfected for fighting in the Mediterranean world, now had to learn how to fight on a global scale against enemies who were nothing like their old foes. It was an arms race on two fronts, and the Romans had no choice but to change or be broken. The defeat at Carrhae in 53 BC was a wake-up call. A Roman army under Crassus was completely annihilated by Parthian cavalry and horse archers. The Roman Kshatriya legions, with their disciplined infantry and weak cavalry, were utterly helpless against an enemy that could shoot them full of arrows from a distance and then disappear before a counterattack could be mounted. It was a humiliating and terrifying lesson. Rome had to adapt, and they did by borrowing once again. They began to recruit and train their own specialized cavalry units, incorporating the tactics of their enemies. They developed cataphracts, heavily armored horsemen inspired by the Persians, whose horses were also armored in chainmail or scale. They also created their own units of sagittarii, or mounted archers, to counter the Parthian horsemen at their own game. This was a crucial shift in military thinking for a culture that had long prioritized its foot soldiers above all else. The Roman military was becoming a combined arms force in a way it never had before, with infantry, heavy cavalry, and skirmishers, working in a coordinated fashion to counter any threat. Part 2. Along the northern borders, the challenge was different. The Germanic tribes fought in decentralized, chaotic formations, and they used the dense forests and swamps to their advantage. A Roman legion, with its rigid formation and heavy equipment, was a slow and vulnerable target in such terrain. The Romans couldn't just rely on open-field battles. They had to control the territory itself. Their answer to this problem was a monumental feat of engineering: the limes, a system of fortified borders. This wasn't just a single wall. It was a complex network of walls, ditches, forts, and watchtowers that stretched for hundreds of miles. Hadrian's Wall in Britain is a famous example, but the fortifications along the Rhine and Danube rivers were just as crucial. These borders were a physical expression of Roman power, a clear line between civilization and the barbarian world. To man these lines, the Romans created a new class of soldiers, the limitanae, or border troops. These were garrison soldiers whose primary job was to patrol, defend, and maintain the fortifications. They weren't a mobile fighting force. That role was reserved for the more elite mobile field armies known as the comitatenses, who were stationed deeper inside the empire and could be quickly dispatched to any point of crisis. This division of labor allowed Rome to maintain a constant, low-level defense while keeping a powerful strike force in reserve. Part 3. In addition to these strategic and tactical shifts, Rome continued to refine its weapons and equipment. The short gladius, so effective in close quarters, was often replaced by the longer spatha sword, especially for cavalry and border troops. who needed more reach. They also adopted the round shield, which was more agile in one-on-one combat, from the very enemies they fought. This willingness to change their most iconic equipment, the sword and the shield, shows just how pragmatic the Romans were. They didn't cling to tradition when it no longer served a purpose. These changes were about more than just fighting a war. They were about maintaining an empire. The lime system wasn't just a military barrier, it was an economic one, controlling the flow of goods and people and asserting Roman authority. The quick-build roads and bridges of the early legions were now a permanent sprawling network that allowed Rome to move men and materials faster than any other civilization, ensuring that a crisis on a distant border could be met with a swift and overwhelming response. The military arms race on the empire's edges was a testament to Rome's continued ability to adapt. They learned to fight on horseback like the Parthians and in small-scale skirmishes like the Germanic tribes. They built an infrastructure to support a continental empire and created specialized military units to match every type of threat. This was a Rome that was constantly changing, constantly learning, and constantly being molded by its enemies. The military machine had become a living, breathing thing. But as the empire grew, its biggest threat wouldn't come from without. It would come from within. By the 3rd century AD, Rome was no longer just a collection of conquered lands. It was a sprawling, interconnected empire. But its very size was becoming a source of internal weakness. The military machine, once a tool of the state, was now its most powerful political player. The loyalty of the armies had shifted. It no longer belonged to the Senate or the people of Rome, but to the generals who commanded them. This new dynamic created a chaotic, brutal era known as the crisis of the 3rd century, where a succession of generals seized power, often only to be assassinated by their own troops in a cycle of violence. The Roman arms race had gone from being an external force for defense and expansion to an internal one for political control. The motivation was simple. If a general wanted to be emperor, they needed the unwavering loyalty of their legions. And how do you earn that loyalty? By providing what the state often couldn't: regular pay, land grants, and lavish bonuses from successful campaigns. The military became a career path for the poor, a way to rise through the ranks based on talent and loyalty to a commander. Generals, like Caesar, had already shown this by using the spoils of Gaul to fund and equip their legions, effectively creating a private army loyal to him alone. Now, this phenomenon was tearing the empire apart. This era of internal strife forced emperors to constantly innovate, not just to fight external enemies, but to keep their own armies happy and in line. The military's needs dictated state policy and, more often than not, state finances. At its height, Rome's military budget consumed up to 80% of the state's revenue. The sheer scale of this operation meant that every innovation, from a new type of armor to a new weapon system, required central funding and organization. Part 2. The emperors who survived this period were the ones who understood this new reality. They didn't just win battles, they mastered military politics. Augustus had already set the precedent by creating a permanent, professional standing army with fixed salaries and a veteran retirement fund. This gave soldiers a reason to be loyal to the emperor, not just their immediate commander. But the crisis of the 3rd century showed that this wasn't enough. Two emperors, Diocletian and Constantine, finally put an end to the chaos by completely reorganizing the army. Diocletian, a military man himself, realized the empire was too big for one man to rule and one army to defend. He split the empire and, more importantly, split the army into 2 distinct forces: the Limitani, the stationary border troops we discussed earlier, and the comitatenses, elite, mobile field armies stationed inland. The Limitani were the first line of defense, a tripwire to alert the empire to a threat. The comitatenses were the hammer, a powerful, rapid response force that could be sent to any border that was breached. Constantine took these reforms even further. He created elite heavy cavalry units, the Scolae, inspired by the cataphracts of the Sassanid Persians. These highly disciplined, heavily armored horsemen were the emperor's personal guard and a key part of his mobile field army. Constantine also disbanded the Praetorian Guard, whose political meddling had caused so much instability, and replaced them with units loyal only to him. He was a master of using military reform to secure his political authority. Part 3. These reforms weren't just about tactical efficiency, they were about projecting power. A well-equipped, disciplined army was the ultimate tool of propaganda, a visible symbol of the emperor's strength and the empire's stability. When Caesar built his bridge across the Rhine in just 10 days, he wasn't just solving a logistical problem. He was sending a powerful, unambiguous message to the Germanic tribes. It was a public demonstration of Roman engineering prowess and a warning of what could be unleashed. The massive aqueducts and roads that improved civilian life also served a military purpose, reinforcing the image of an invincible authority. The Roman military machine had become a symbiotic partner to the political state. As one historian put it, Roman war tech grew out of and fed into the political economy of empire building, and its social structure determined who fought and with what. The army's needs shaped the economy, its officers became the political elite, and its innovations were a direct response to both external enemies and internal rivals. The Roman arms race had become a way of life, an eternal process of adaptation and innovation, driven by the constant need for both survival and control. In the end, Rome's survival depended not just on winning battles, but on managing the complex relationship between military power and political authority. Their ability to innovate, reorganize, and adapt their army in response to this politically charged environment was the real secret to their longevity. But what was the ultimate legacy of this relentless military machine? And what can it teach us about strength, power, and the art of adaptation? We've come to the end of our journey, from a scrappy city-state on the brink of collapse to a sprawling empire that dominated the known world for centuries. But the story of Rome's military success isn't a simple tale of one brilliant invention or one decisive battle. It's a story of constant, relentless adaptation, a living case study in what it takes to not just survive, but to thrive in a world of constant competition. In the short term, this approach gave Rome clear advantages over its powerful enemies. From the Carthaginian navy to the Hellenistic phalanx, a well-trained, disciplined, and organized army allowed them to win battles against foes who were often stronger, faster, or more technologically sophisticated. But the long-term impact of this approach was far more profound. It didn't just win battles. It shaped the Roman state, its society, and, in many ways, the entire future of Western military traditions. So what was the secret to their success? It wasn't genius invention. It was their uncanny ability to learn. They were the ultimate students of war, constantly borrowing, refining, and perfecting the ideas of their enemies. Carthage's ships, Celtic chainmail, Persian horse armor, all were absorbed into the Roman military machine and turned into something uniquely their own. Rome understood that a great military isn't just about the tools you have, but about the systems that support them. The most powerful weapon wasn't the gladius or the catapult. It was the logistics, the organization, and the discipline. The fact that a Roman legionary could march for miles and then build a complete fortified camp in a matter of hours was a form of technology just as crucial as any siege engine. This was a military model that was practical, reliable, and most importantly, sustainable. Part 2. Rome's strength came from a philosophy of integration. They created an army that was more than the sum of its parts. Infantry wasn't just a line of men, it was a flexible formation that worked in perfect sync with cavalry and specialized engineers. Their fleets used ingenious inventions like the Corvus to turn sea battles into land fights, leveraging their greatest strength to overcome their greatest weakness. And when those inventions were no longer needed, they had the courage and the pragmatism to abandon them for better, more flexible tactics. This process of constant evolution set Rome apart from its rivals. Many civilizations had brilliant military traditions, but few were as willing to change and adapt. Think of the Greek phalanx, which remained relatively unchanged for centuries, or the Parthian reliance on horse archers. Rome, by contrast, was in a constant state of transformation. Their army was a living, breathing entity that evolved with every new challenge it faced. This made them resilient. When they suffered a crushing defeat like at Carrhae, they didn't crumble. They learned, they adapted, And they came back stronger. The Roman arms race was a holistic one. It wasn't just about better weapons. It was about better leadership, better logistics, better engineering, and better strategy. The political pressures of the 3rd century, far from destroying the military, forced it to become even more professional and more responsive, giving us the sophisticated command structures of the late empire. The military and the state became two sides of the same coin, each feeding into the other in a perpetual cycle of innovation. Part 3. In the end, Rome's legacy isn't just about empire and conquest. It's about a strategic and philosophical approach to power that would resonate for centuries. The Roman model of professional soldiery, organized legions, and a logistical network that supported them all became the blueprint for every major European army that followed. Their engineering achievements, from roads to aqueducts, didn't just serve a military purpose. They cemented their reputation and shaped the infrastructure of a continent. Rome's story shows us that true strength doesn't come from being the first to invent something, but from being the best at adapting, learning, and perfecting. It comes from a willingness to leave behind old ways when they no longer work, and to borrow from your enemies without ego or hesitation. It's a powerful lesson, and it's why the Roman military machine remains one of the most compelling and enduring stories in all of human history. There so much more to explore in the military history of Rome. If you want a deeper dive into their famous weapons and armor, the brutal realities of legionary life, or the tactical genius of their most famous generals, let us know in the comments below. We're eager to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.